So, Kevin, let's start by painting a picture of the town. So for listeners that aren't familiar with Moscow, Idaho, talk to us about what it's like and how it was perceived before the murders.
Moscow is in the Idaho Panhandle, and that's about 6 hours north of the capital in Boise. Moscow is a small college town, although for Idaho, it's not terribly small. It's the county is about 40,000 people, and the town of Moscow, the city of Moscow, is about 25,000 people. That's largely based on the college campus, however, the flagship university for the state. You hear this cliche often, but Moscow is the type of place where you didn't lock your door. And that really is a true statement. And many people I spoke to over the course of my reporting and my own introduction to Moscow, my first time up there was actually following the quadruple homicides. But they said, it's a quiet, peaceful place. It's a lot of farmland and what many would consider rural. But like I said, because Idaho is a smaller state, a population of about 2 million, a community of 45,000 people is not terribly small, but it is the comings and goings of college students per the academic calendar. And many find their homes there afterwards. Many stay because they just find it to be a really beautiful and serene place.
Yeah, and I went to University of Washington, and our rivals are Washington State, which are it's an 8-minute drive from University of Idaho. So I spent a lot of time there myself and in college, and it's so fun. And especially for collegiates, it was so fun. Now, we know that the incoming freshman class of University of Idaho that year was the largest that they'd ever have. It was finally after COVID, they were getting back, and then this happens. Talk to us about the perception of University of Idaho, the vandals, and what the campus was like. Was it safe? Talk to us about that identity.
Idaho overall is a terribly safe state. It has one of the lowest violent crime rates in the country. It has never or rarely experienced something like a quadruple homicide, let alone on the college campus. Now, there is the occasional crime, of course. It is a college community. It's younger folks drinking, partying, the usual stuff you would expect out of a college community. But it was and remains a really safe place. There was just this horrible tragedy that happened and not something they could have foreseen, prepared for, and it was devastating, not only to Moscow, but the entire state of Idaho. Many people have direct connections and links to the University of Idaho, whether they attended or maybe their children. It's the only law school in the state. So many of the attorneys who were on this case all had come through that program. So everyone has links to it, despite the distance from the capital. But it is a place near and dear to many people's hearts, and they go up there for travel, vacation, getaways, or to maybe even relive their college years and go to the local college bar.
Yeah. Okay, so now walk us through what we know about the timeline on the night of this horrific tragedy. Where was everyone before heading home or heading back to 1122 King Road? And then what do we know about how the killings took place?
Sure. The victims were Kaylee Goncalves, Let me try that again.
Sorry.
The 4 victims were Kaylee Goncalves, Madison Mogen, Ethan Chapin, and Xana Kernodle. The 3 young women lived in the home with 2 other female roommates who went physically unharmed. Ethan Chapin was Xana's boyfriend and was staying over for the night. The 2 pairs were separate during the course of the evening. Ethan Chapin and Xana Kernodle were at Ethan's fraternity for a party, and they were there until about 1:45 in the morning, maybe about 2 a.m., and that's only about 600 feet from the King Road property. That's how close that fraternity is. That's the new Greek row for the university. Greek life is a significant component of the campus life. I think it's about a quarter of the campus is a member of a fraternity or sorority. And so they made their way after the party back to the home, where reporting seems to indicate that Ethan stayed frequently. And Kaylee and Maddie were out on the town also for a night of revelry. And they were last seen at the Corner Club, which is kind of the local college dive bar, very sports themed, kind of the place you would go after a football game. And then that night happened to be, or that afternoon happened to be the final home game for the University of Idaho Vandals. They played a football game at the Kibbe Dome, which is well known, indoor football stadium and they lost the game to UC Davis after a pretty strong season, actually. But afterwards, Kaylee and Maddie go to the college bar, the Corner Club, and they left a little after 1:30 a.m. and they walked to Friendship Square, which is right downtown. And that's where a local food truck, one of the few places you can get late night food in Moscow, had parked for that evening. And they pulled up, and we can see that from Twitch camera footage that was released pretty early in, that they had ordered a carbonara, macaroni and cheese. And then they were kind of with some friends, kind of goofing around a little bit, and then they hopped a ride share from someone in town and get back to the house at about 2 a.m. So everyone was back at roughly 2 in the morning. Reporting seems to indicate that they all kind of hung out, the group of friends, and stayed up late chatting. The last to go to sleep was Xana, and we know that because, according to the probable cause affidavit, she was first she ordered DoorDash food. It was Jack in the Box that was delivered at 3:59 a.m. So she was awake for that, and then she was scrolling on TikTok until about, I think the time was 4:17. Or 4:12 a.m. is what time that was. And so that's how they were able to build a timeline about their whereabouts and, use security camera from the area to see a white vehicle believed to be a 2015 Hyundai Elantra that had circled the area, parked, and then over the course of a 13-minute window, the 4 victims were killed.
Kevin, what do we know about how the killings took place during that 13-minute window?
We long had questions about the order of the victims' deaths, and we learned at Brian Kohberger's change of plea hearing from prosecutor Bill Thompson that they believe Brian Kohberger entered without forced entry at the sliding glass door, which is on the second floor. It's on the back side of the home, kind of the ground floor, but on the back side, it's the second floor technically. He immediately walks through the kitchen and goes up to the third floor, where he finds Madison Mogen and Kaylee Goncalves asleep in Madison's room. Kaylee also had a dog across in her room where the door was open, and he was left there. He moves forward with of the killings, and with a large fixed blade knife, each victim was killed with multiple wounds, according to the coroner and police. Madison Mogen had no defensive wounds, which suggested she never saw what really hit her, unfortunately. According to the parents of Kaylee Goncalves, their daughter put up quite a fight, and she received a lot of the violence. In fact, her nose had been broken, according to the family, in the midst of the struggle. Due to the commotion and the dog barking at 4:17 a.m., it is believed that Xana Kernodle then walks upstairs to see what was going on and encounters Kohberger, who then chases her back down to her second floor room where she was found dead. And there was quite a struggle there as well. It is believed that Xana had defensive wounds in the midst of their struggle, where she also died of multiple stab wounds from a large fixed blade knife, believed to be a K-bar. Police later found the K-bar knife sheath near Maddie's body, which is kind of how they solved the crime ultimately because of DNA. After dispensing of Xana, unfortunately, then Kohberger turned his attention to her boyfriend, Ethan Chapin, who was asleep in bed. It doesn't sound like he ever woke up from what had transpired, and he died primarily from a single blow, although there's reporting that indicates his legs had been carved afterwards before Kohberger then exited the crime scene back through the sliding glass door, where one of the surviving roommates had witnessed a black-clothed figure exit in that direction before closing her own door and locking it.
So who made the 911 call, and what details were known at that time? What was that call like?
A very confusing element of this whole case was that the crime occurred at, Kohberger had left by 4:20 in the morning and raced out of there, out of that cul-de-sac with his car. And the 911 call was not made till almost noon that same morning, well, that same day. But it was a point of confusion, not something that police could really explain. And what ultimately happened was one of the roommates who had witnessed a man in the home ran down and stayed with her first floor roommate, who also went unharmed. And the next day, they called friends over. And three friends actually came over from a nearby apartment complex. One of them was a man, and he was checking on their friends because they had heard some commotion the roommates had. And so they make this 911 call, and for the longest time, we were not told who made the call, but it was made from one of the two roommates' cell phones, and it was passed around among four different people, three women and the one man, to explain to police they were concerned about an unconscious person, happened to be Xana Kernodle, according to the probable cause affidavit.
And so what was the initial police response? What was it like? And did anything raise eyebrows early on? Because now what I'm hearing is that call was potentially unconscious roommates. We know now it was a horrific bloodbath of a quadruple homicide. So was anything like that relayed on the call? And from your reporting, what did the police think that they were responding to, and how did that part unfold?
The 911 call is a difficult listen, and it came out through public records about, a handful of months ago, finally, after more than 2 years of waiting for it. And it was released once transcripts were released in court. And what you have is a terrified young woman trying to explain to the dispatcher that something has happened in their home, but they're not quite sure. And the dispatcher very calmly directs her, well, I need to know what's happening right now. And it's reported that there's an unconscious roommate. She had been drinking last night and she's not waking up. And that is the extent of what they know. And so the phone gets passed around. They explain where they're located. And again, it was stated that it was an unconscious person, one individual, and they didn't know the whereabouts or the specifics about it. But you can hear live on the call as the young man, who was a good friend of Ethan Chapin's, he enters the room and then tells everyone else to get out, get out, get out, because he's aware and can see blood on the floor, Xana in a very awkward position, laying on the ground, and Ethan in the bed, and they're not moving. We did learn later that he had checked their pulses and then grabbed a knife from the kitchen and waited in the living room for police. But in a 5-minute call, as police arrive with defibrillators and are themselves entering thinking it's just someone passed out, they come across this terrible scene. Nobody had checked the third floor. They just could not reach Kaylee or Maddie, and it was discovered later, including by the roommates and the friends who had come over, that their other two friends and roommates had been killed overnight.
So you're saying the roommates never even went up to the third floor, and so the police officers discovered those two murders simultaneously with the roommates because they just knew they couldn't reach them with their phones, and so first they just saw Ethan and Xana.
Correct.
Yeah. And when he's saying get out, it's because the realization that there's been such violence, so he's trying to protect. They're not sure if the threat is still there.
That's right.
Yeah,
and again, according to reporting, he had grabbed a knife from the kitchen in order to just make sure that there wasn't someone in the home. The young women had all exited because he had told them to leave, and he was there to protect them and ensure that they didn't see it, and then they awaited. Police were there within moments and, jumped to the scene to try to assist. The ambulance actually had been called through the local volunteer fire department, but was immediately turned away. A really heartbreaking moment that the friends realized as basically the resource was dismissed, that their friends had been killed. So
how soon did authorities confirm publicly that there had been a quadruple homicide? And then what was the public reaction like? Because what you've described is, essentially a very confusing morning for these poor kids, right? Because no one expects anything like this. And so finally at noon, the 911 call comes, and then police respond. Police realize the extent of this, as do the roommates. And then what happens?
Pretty quickly therein, the responding officers contacted dispatch and got a hold of Chief James Fry, who was traveling at the time. And on their call list, Prosecutor Bill Thompson is high on that list as well. He also happened to be traveling at that time. But they started to get the phone tree going and realizing that this was a significant incident. So you have your on-duty commander and some of your supervisors, and James Fry made the call to bring in Idaho State Police. This was something beyond the extent that a local police department could handle. And so they brought in forensics teams and all the peers they could from the state resources. And not long after, they also brought in the FBI. So that was kind of the immediate response. I've spoken with Bill Thompson in the past, and he explained that this was, one of the largest resources he'd ever seen in his, at that time, about 30 years in his elected position. It was obviously a massive response to try to get to the bottom of this quickly. The police department was in touch with the university. They have a partner relationships where officers work on campus through a shared agreement. And so there's a lot of lines of communication there. The university responded by issuing what's called a vandal alert with reference to the school mascot. And they were alerting everyone in the neighborhood and across the college campus that there had been some homicides or a police presence and an incident that they were investigating on King Road, which is where the home is located, and basically keep away. We do know from interviews with the friends who came over and discovered the bodies that they were not told by police directly that there had been 4 homicides. They didn't know where the friends were. They did not know that information until a updated vandal alert went out and described 4 homicides, a quadruple incident. And that is how they learned their friends, all 4, had been killed.
And describe that timeline. Was it that same day? And were the alerts, did the campus then do a shelter in place? Did they say there's someone on the loose still? How was that communicated to the students for their safety?
This became a big point of contention during the early days of the investigation, where police had said they believed that it was a targeted incident. They couldn't really describe who or what exactly, and they didn't. And even under question from the media and a 3-day delay for the first press conference for any additional information through that outlet, they never really explained that. They did tell people to remain vigilant. They believed the community was safe. They did not have a suspect or anyone in custody, of course. That took many weeks, but they believed that it was targeted. And whether it was the home or one of the individuals, that's never really truly been defined. And we still await any sort of information to understand who Bryan Kohberger might have had a particular interest in. Interestingly, at his change of plea hearing, Bill Thompson described that while the state would not say at a potential trial that Kohberger entered the home expecting or with a desire to kill 4 people, that was ultimately the end result.
And then what was the nature of the rest of the school's response as they were dealing with 4 of their students that had been killed?
Yes, a tragic incident, of course, and the university immediately canceled school for the next day, and it was near the Thanksgiving holiday, so many people stopped going to class as they entered the break the 2 weeks leading up to that. Many students didn't return for the end of the semester for finals and took those virtually. If there was any benefit from COVID, it was that the university was set up for such testing and so forth. But many families had to make decisions about whether or not they were going to send their kid back. And those were, I'm sure, tough decisions in kitchens across the country and certainly in our state on whether or not they were going to come back. But to alleviate stress and concerns, the university set up a system where they had people who would walk students across campus. They, of course, were recommending to travel in pairs, not stay out too late. And at that time of the year, it gets dark about 4:30 p.m. So essentially, if you're on campus to get to class and then get home, I wouldn't say it was a shelter in place, but it was a recommendation to consider your surroundings, which also continued to be the police's discussion of remain vigilant. And that was all the way up until December 30th when they announced the arrest of Bryan Kohberger.
And let's just focus for a moment on sort of the media interplay with that in the community and law enforcement. These murders shocked the country. And reporters, including you, they flew in to cover this. And so describe the dynamic, or if there was any tension between the press and law enforcement and the local community there.
There was definitely tension. And in those early days, including myself, we were in contact with Captain Anthony Dollinger, who is now the police chief there after the retirement of James Fry. And he was acting as a public information officer. But they really weren't releasing much information beyond that there had been 4 homicides. And while that term is used sometimes to describe murders, they were not using the word murder. There can be homicide from any number of things, and that created a lot of rumors in the community. And also with these gaps in information, the media was left to try to find any detail possible. And that sent even more waves of people to the community to ask neighbors and learn everything about the community, the fraternity and sorority system, all of that. But again, police did not host a press conference for three and a half days. Chief James Fry got to the podium and he acknowledged that he should have probably been there at least a day earlier, but that he was there now, and he knew there were a lot of questions, but they had a lot of questions too. And I wouldn't say it was a confrontational relationship between the law enforcement and media, but the press, acting on behalf of the public, did have a lot of questions that went unanswered. And it was in subsequent press conferences that included state police, the university presidents, other members of their staff explaining the details that they could allow to trickle out in order to protect the integrity of the investigation and give what they could away. But it was a slow drip. In terms of the media's presence in Moscow, it is a smaller community. The mayor of Moscow, Art Bedke, had told me that it did become kind of a nuisance. And there were national media, as one example, flying in and putting microphones in regular Moscow residents' faces over breakfast. And, people became very annoyed by it. They were already suffering through this tragedy. And then to be overwhelmed by a media presence they were not traditionally familiar with, it did become a little tense.
Did the chief, other than acknowledging I should have done this sooner, did he ever explain why there was radio silence in the first few days and say, it was because we were trying to gather information? Because, look, we both work in national news. It's usually same day that local law enforcement or authorities have something, even if it is just to say there's been a quadruple homicide. We know nothing yet. We will let you know. It's sort of like we're on it. And without it, to your point, it led to a lot of questions. Was that ever addressed?
Chief Fry's retirement is what it was. After 29 years with the department, including 8 as the chief, he had just reached a point of an ability to retire. He actually ran for sheriff of the county, lost, but now he is signed on as chief of a department in Washington's Tri-Cities. So that was unrelated completely from anything to do with botching the investigation or whatever. The point that police, led by James Fry, about keeping information close to the vest had to do with protecting the integrity of the investigation. They knew what they could. They knew a lot of information, but they were gathering more and more, including through forensics and the beginning of search warrants to understand who may have been in the neighborhood, everything from cell tower pings to surveillance cameras in the neighborhoods. They were asking everybody eventually for any information they knew or things they heard. And it was a sprawling investigation, and it took a lot of time to use your resources appropriately to get the details and find what was available to try to piece this thing together, which after 7 weeks, they did with the assistance of the Idaho State Police and the FBI. And I think any sort of scrutiny and critique about their investigation was eventually washed away because they solved the crime.
And there's always the tension between the public's right to know or interest in knowing with, to your point, protecting the integrity of the investigation. And we've covered many horrific crimes and cases where leaked information has a detrimental effect and prolongs. They know it scares off the guy that they have in their sights, or et cetera, tips them off that they're onto him. So notwithstanding that, what were the biggest unanswered questions in those initial weeks that drove the narrative?
Even leading up to the arrest of Bryan Kohberger on December 30th, 2022 in Pennsylvania, there had been no indication or implication that they had a suspect. We at the Idaho Statesman had interviewed Bill Thompson just 2 days before, and he was confident that the crime would be solved, as would be how you would project such a thing. He said nothing of the sort, kept it close to the vest. No member of law enforcement ever indicated anything about actually having figured out who this was. We later learned that by December 19th, they had found that to be his DNA, and they were starting to build their case for an arrest warrant and search warrants of his apartment and office at Washington State University, in addition to his effects and everything at his parents' home in eastern Pennsylvania in the Poconos. So there were questions, and some of those even remain today. The who was answered. Bryan Kohberger admitted guilt for these 4 murders in the last couple of weeks. but we still don't really have an answer about why, which has frustrated the families, victims in particular. Additional questions we had were, what happened to the murder weapon? That was a big one. Again, we knew it was a large fixed blade knife. Police were pretty protective of that information. We didn't know the order of the victims. We learned that Kaylee and Maddie were discovered in the same bed by Kaylee's father at a memorial event. I mean, there were certain details that police really kept behind closed doors, but they would slowly leak out. And I know this was the type of information they didn't want to release because they knew one of the few people who would know that information and they could verify these things through would be the killer. So beyond that, there were also just a number of questions police couldn't get to or just declined to comment in the moments in those early days and weeks. We were in the media still trying to just understand the whereabouts of the 4 victims, where they were that night, who they were with. It was the slow trickle of information. A lot of that didn't come out until the release of the probable cause affidavit, which was associated with Koberger's arrest on December 30th. We came to learn that the victims were out in pairs and what time they got back and what time they might have gone to bed. And initially it was believed that the crime had occurred in a 25-minute window between 4 and 4:25 a.m. Police had determined that, but it was later narrowed to this 13-minute window. But a lot of these details were things that they didn't describe. They didn't tell us what the murder weapon was. They believed it was a large fixed blade knife. That was the extent of what we knew. We didn't know how the individuals were killed. We knew that they were fatally stabbed, but we don't, even to this day, we still don't know the specifics of that. And now without a trial, a lot of that won't come out, publicly at least.
And it's hard, the reality is, when it's a college town and it's a football night and everyone's drinking and it's late, memories are soft to begin with, and it's really difficult to, I think, accurately map out what exactly happened. And talk to us about the resources that police relied on as we learned later. You mentioned the apps that the students themselves were using and cameras around, and was there testimony from the hot dog vendor and the Uber driver, and how did they sort of piece together at the time what that full picture looked like?
Yeah, a particularly interesting case because these students were moving around the community, and I mentioned Xana was on TikTok, so there was a search warrant. We had been told that it was a ride share. We didn't know if it was Uber or what it was exactly. It happened to be a student on campus who was a designated driver and helping get students back and forth. But police, of course, interviewed that person. Police interviewed the grub truck, is what it's called, the food truck where Kaylee and Maddie had purchased food before they headed home. There was a DoorDash delivery, and police located her and got information from her about her timeline. A lot of that certainly played into the investigation, at least eliminating certain individuals. There were a lot of rumors online about, could it have been somebody tied to these people, maybe an ex-boyfriend, that sort of thing. And interviews conducted by police, they cleared a lot of those people pretty early in, including a gentleman who was with the 2 women at the food truck. He was eliminated as a potential suspect very early in. As far as resources, I mentioned the Idaho State Police were immediately on the case, and they were then processing the DNA they discovered, a single male DNA found on the knife sheath next to Madison Mogen's body in the bed. And that really was the key to unlocking the entire case. They used a process known as Investigative Genetic Genealogy. It's called IgG. And that's primarily used in cold cases. It's how police, after decades, discovered the Golden State Killer as one example. We're increasingly seeing that used in active cases like this one, where we need to get somebody who's extremely dangerous off of the street. And they use that in collaboration with a private lab out of Texas, and then the FBI took over that process. Eventually, a trash pull was done at the Koberger family residence. A Q-tip was used and processed at the Idaho State lab outside of Boise. And they discovered that the individuals whose DNA was on that Q-tip was Brian Koberger's father. And the way that they figured that out was essentially the DNA on the knife sheath was the son of whoever's DNA was on that Q-tip. And so by process of elimination, they knew that Brian Koberger lived in the area, and they knew that Brian Koberger's father only had one son. So when they arrested him, they did a cheek swab and had a direct match, they say, between the knife sheath DNA and Brian Koberger. Security cam footage you mentioned from around the community. They went and asked area businesses as they tried to figure out the route of the white vehicle that had been in the neighborhood and circling for an hour to piece that together. Suspect vehicle 1 is what they refer to that as. And they in order to try to get more information, police did eventually reach out to the public and say they believed it was a white Hyundai Elantra between the years 2011 and 2013. So they had it not quite right, and they amended that, never communicated that to the public. But then, of course, Brian Koberger's vehicle was a 2015, very similar body type. So they had reached out to the public. They used cell phone tower information. Koberger's phone was turned off or in airplane mode during the exact window of the crime, but then they discovered that he had entered from Pullman into Moscow, and then his phone went off, and then about 48 minutes later, it was more than an hour later, his phone came back on just south of Moscow as it made its return trip back on the back roads, rural community, back to Pullman at 5:31 a.m.
Kevin, talk to us about the 4 victims, Maddie and Kaylee and Xana and Ethan, and how the community grieved them.
It was a terrible process. They were very popular in the community, well-known, well-liked. The Greek community makes up about a quarter of the college campus. And I'll start with Ethan. He was a member of the Sigma Chi fraternity, and as was his brother Hunter. And then their sister, so they are triplets, Maisie, was also a member of Greek life in one of the local sororities. Ethan was a boisterous and athletic type. His mother, Stacy, had mentioned that he was still considered a freshman, despite having attended for his second year. I'm not sure his grades were particularly strong, but he was a guy who didn't necessarily love class, but loved college. And he was known as fun-loving, a jet skier, had grown up in Mount Vernon, Washington, but the family has a second home on Priest Lake in North Idaho, and a lot of lake days. And that was really his makeup. Very tight-knit family among the 5 of them, the 3 triplets and their parents. And somebody who was probably still hitting his stride to some extent, but had connected with Xana Kernodle after getting to know her through campus life, including Greek life, developed a deep bond. Friends say that they were basically the same personality, just one was male and one was female, and so they were a hit. And Stacy Chapin, Ethan's mother, had talked about it. It was clear when the family met her and she had come and spent some time with the family on the lake that the relationship had gotten pretty serious. Xana came from North Idaho. The 3 women are all from there, and kind of an up and down life. Her parents had split. Her dad lives in Arizona, and she has an older sister as well, Jasmine, who was attending school at Washington State University for a graduate degree. So in the area, but Xana moved between Arizona and North Idaho, spent a lot of time with other friends' families as her parents were sometimes in the picture and sometimes not. And I think really enjoyed college as well, fun-loving, had been a gymnast growing up, also in the same sorority with Madison Mogen. And they had a deep bond, as did the other roommates. Everybody was part of that same sorority except for Kaylee Goncalves, who was part of a different sorority. But sorority life was important. They were all, good college kids partying, but with good grades and, fun on the weekends. That's really the makeup. And that was one of the party houses. It's kind of the runoff for Greek life. And they had gotten this home and were very excited, and a tight-knit group of friends. Madison Mogen and Xana worked together at a Greek restaurant downtown. They both were servers. Maddie had helped get Xana a job at the restaurant. And so that's what they did on the side. They worked as servers. Maddie was working in marketing and assisting the restaurant with some of its marketing efforts and advertising. When the 4 victims had been killed, candles stayed lit outside of the Matt Greek, it was called. It's no longer there, actually. Just has moved on, the owner. But candles were lit consistently in the days and weeks after their deaths for months and months as a tribute to the 4 victims. Kaylee Goncalves actually was set to graduate that December. so a semester early, and was interested in IT work and had interned with Extreme Networks out of Texas. And then that was supposed to transition into full-time work, and she was going to be moving to the Austin area. One of the more tragic elements of this is Kaylee wasn't even supposed to be there that night. She came down from North Idaho where she lived, and where she and Maddie had grown up and been best friends since sixth grade. She had come down to attend the football game and kind of a last hurrah to see her friends and roommates. And she had recently bought a Range Rover and wanted to show that off to her friends as well. So she made the trip. She was down for the weekend. And of course, this unfortunate tragedy struck them all.
Looking back at your initial coverage of this case, what moments stuck with you the most?
It's probably recency bias, but the change of plea hearing came as such a shock. We were 4 weeks away from jury selection, 6 weeks away from trial, and suddenly there's breaking information that Bryan Kohberger, after more than 2.5 years of legal proceedings and all of that time in custody, whether it was in Moscow or down in Boise for about a year, he had struck a deal. He had agreed to plead guilty to all charges, including felony burglary and 4 counts of first-degree murder, in exchange for dropping the death penalty and no chance of parole on consecutive life sentences and no ability to appeal. This is a case that has shocked and created more curiosity about a murder case than I've ever experienced, and many in the nation were compelled at every movement and motion of this case and the legal proceedings over all that time. And after all said and done, we don't even end up with a trial to learn many of the details. So that stuck with me. And being in the courtroom to experience that and see in a very robotic and emotionless way him accept responsibility for having murdered these individuals. We still don't know a motive of any kind. We know some of his criminology history and the things he studied, including serial killers in graduate school and DeSales University in Pennsylvania under a really well-known and prestigious forensic psychologist. We know that about Bryan Kohberger. A packed house at the courtroom in Boise. Again, everyone expecting a trial to begin, and instead, the case was once again flipped on its head, as happened many, many times over the course of these years. And it was kind of a surreal experience watching Bryan Kohberger not only admit that he did that, but also plead guilty and answer questions from the judge over the course of about a 50-minute hearing. And in terms of my local coverage up in Moscow, I spent a number of weeks up there, back and forth, trying to understand what was happening during the course of the investigation. And I can recall very vividly knocking on doors of the neighbors, for example, right near the home, which no longer stands. But even weeks in, they were still just so shocked, whether or not they knew the victims themselves or had walked by the home and seen them out on the backyard with drinks and friends. It was very personal to each of those individuals. Everybody had some direct connection. One guy, I knocked on his door. Oh yeah, I didn't know them, but my girlfriend was in a sorority with one of them, and just the deep impact it had on her. It was not only the loss of life and the loss of students, and 4 students at that. It was people who were well known, well liked, somebody you'd run into consistently, always with a smile, and it really touched the community. It hurt the community very deeply. And I don't think it's something that they will ever really get over. They will be able to heal and move forward, did that with the arrest, and now seemingly some level of conclusion in the case with Bryan Kohberger's conviction after pleading guilty. But it will remain in Moscow, and these will never be forgotten people. There's a memorial that the school built that's dedicated to them and also other victims of crimes and suicide, things like that, on campus. So there's always visual reminders as well, but I think the spirit of who has become the Idaho 4 will remain forever.
Kevin, what happened with the house?
About a year after the arrest of Bryan Kohberger, very controversially, the home was actually knocked down. The home had been owned by a private individual who then gifted it to the university to basically make a decision about what to do with it. It was a horrific scene. It had been cleaned up, and they Prosecution and defense had been through many, many times for evidentiary purposes to understand the dynamics of the crime. The FBI had done 3D imaging of the interior, and the university, although it was delayed more than once, did make the decision to knock the home down. The prosecution and the defense both stipulated to the fact that they no longer had evidentiary needs for the home, and the university, while has not made decisions about what will happen to the actual property, did knock it down on December 28th, 2023, early morning hours, almost in the dark of morning. And it upset several of the families out of concern that perhaps jurors might want to see and experience what sounds are like in there, and what sightlines looked like if there were questions about what one of the surviving roommates may have eyewitnessed. And as she saw the man who was Brian Kober exiting in the direction of the backsliding glass door. But the home is no longer standing. It's a vacant lot with thatch. It was an eyesore, obviously, for the community. The university president, Scott Green, determined that it was something that just had to go. It was just a constant reminder, and the community needed to begin to heal.